Have you ever been judged by your appearance? What would you do if the very people who should protect you saw you as a threat just because of the color of your skin? Marcus had always believed in the idea of fairness. He worked hard, kept to himself, and followed the rules. A modest man with a simple life. He didn't expect much. Yet, as he sat behind the wheel of his old car that Wednesday morning, heading to work, the sudden flashing lights in his rearview mirror sent a shiver down his spine. The police officer who stepped out of his cruiser was tall and imposing, a man whose hardened expression matched his stance. He walked toward Marcus's vehicle with a deliberate pace, eyes scanning the interior as if looking for a reason to be suspicious. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the sun, but there was something in the officer's stride that made Marcus uneasy. The officer leaned down, peering through the window with an air of superiority. "What's a man like you doing in a car like this?" he asked, his tone condescending. Marcus kept his gaze forward, not willing to let his nerves show. He'd been through enough to know that staying calm was his best option. "I'm on my way to work," he answered simply. The officer didn't seem satisfied. He glanced at Marcus's car again, then at Marcus. "You know, this car looks like it's been reported stolen," the officer muttered, though there was no real evidence to support that claim. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He wasn't about to escalate things. The officer smirked and stepped back. "Stay in the car," he barked before walking away. Marcus sat there, still and quiet, watching as the officer returned to his vehicle to run the information. It was a routine stop, or so it seemed, but the air felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. Minutes ticked by, and Marcus felt the weight of the officer's gaze even as he sat in his car. He knew this feeling, the subtle judgment, the way people looked at him as if he didn't belong, as if he was less. It was something he'd carried for years, the sense that the world saw him as a threat simply because of his skin. And then it happened. Without warning, the officer returned, his face now a mask of authority and suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had done nothing wrong. His license was clean. His car was his, bought and paid for. But he knew that in these moments, reasoning with a man like this wouldn't make a difference. He opened the door, his movements deliberate, his expression stoic. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer demanded, already reaching for his gloves. Marcus stood still, his heart racing beneath his chest. He had been searched before, but this felt different. There was no reason for it. No cause. Just the simple fact that he was a black man in a modest car. The officer started to frisk him roughly, his hands invasive, patting Marcus down with unnecessary force. Marcus held his breath, trying to stay calm, trying to remain dignified. But it was hard. He could feel the eyes of bystanders on him, feel the shame creeping up his neck. His pride, his dignity, were being stripped away in front of them. It was an open humiliation. A crowd began to gather, their phones raised, recording the scene as the officer continued his search. They whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others offering silent support through their eyes. But there was nothing anyone could do. Marcus was alone in this moment, vulnerable under the harsh gaze of both the officer and the crowd. Despite the officer's growing frustration, Marcus remained silent. He knew better than to argue. He knew better than to raise his voice or make any sudden movements. He could feel the heat of the sun on his back and the tension in the air, but he kept his body still, his breath steady. The officer finished the search with no results. No stolen car, no weapons, nothing. Yet the man's eyes lingered on Marcus for a moment longer, filled with suspicion, as though he expected to find something that wasn't there. It was then that a new vehicle appeared, cutting through the crowd, its sirens muted, but its presence undeniable. The car pulled up slowly, and a man in a well-tailored suit stepped out. The officer stood at attention, his face now stiff with recognition. The man who approached Marcus was older, his gray hair neatly combed, and his expression serious. He wore a calm, collected demeanor that contrasted sharply with the officer's brash, aggressive posture. "Is there a problem here?" the newcomer asked, his voice firm, yet not harsh. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "This man's car looks stolen. We're just doing a routine search." The man's gaze flickered to Marcus, then back to the officer. "Routine, huh? Well, I believe you've already done your routine search, and I'm sure there's nothing here that justifies this treatment." The officer's face paled as the truth began to sink in. The man in the suit was no ordinary passerby. He was the police commissioner. And Marcus had no idea who he was or why he was here. But the next words out of the days that followed were a blur for Marcus. What started as an ordinary, albeit humiliating, traffic stop had quickly spiraled into something much bigger. The video of the encounter had gone viral within hours, spreading across social media and news outlets. Headlines screamed about the injustice he had faced, the racial profiling that had been exposed, and the shock of the officer's actions. Marcus had become an unwilling symbol in a national conversation about racism, but he never imagined the impact it would have. At first, Marcus had wanted nothing more than to return to his quiet life. He hadn't asked for this attention, this fame that had suddenly thrust itself upon him. But as the media storm swirled around him, he couldn't help but see the bigger picture. People were listening. People were paying attention. His story was resonating with so many others who had felt the sting of discrimination, who had faced unfair treatment because of the color of their skin. He began to realize that, in a strange and painful way, his experience could spark change. The commissioner's apology had been genuine, but Marcus knew that an apology alone wouldn't fix the deep-rooted issues in the police department. The officer involved had been placed on leave pending an investigation, and the commissioner had promised a full review of the department's practices. But Marcus knew that systemic change would take more than just a few public statements. It would take time, effort, and, most importantly, accountability. One evening, as Marcus sat alone in his small apartment, his phone buzzed with a new notification. It was from the commissioner. "We need to talk. Meet me tomorrow, 9 a.m., the department building." Marcus stared at the message, feeling a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. What could the commissioner want now? Was this just another public relations move, or was he serious about making things right? The next morning, Marcus arrived at the police department, greeted by a security guard who showed him to a small conference room. The room was quiet, sterile, its walls lined with plaques and awards. He had expected to be met by a room full of officers, but it was just the commissioner sitting at the head of the table. He gestured for Marcus to take a seat across from him. "I know you probably didn't expect to be here today," the commissioner began, his voice calm but serious. "And I understand that what happened to you was wrong. But I want to make sure you understand something. This wasn't just about one officer. This is about a culture within this department, and it's something that I'm committed to changing." Marcus nodded, unsure of what to say. He had heard words like this before, promises made in the heat of a scandal that often faded as quickly as they appeared. "I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years, the commissioner continued, "and I've seen a lot. But this incident shook me to my core. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we can move forward, how we can make sure something like this never happens again. But I can't do it alone. We need the community's input. We need to listen." Marcus felt a flicker of hope, but it was faint. "What are you asking me to do?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm asking you to be a part of the solution," the commissioner replied. "I want you to help me create a task force, a group of people, community leaders, activists, citizens who've been impacted by racial profiling, to help us reimagine how we interact with the community. This isn't about revenge. It's about finding a way to heal, to rebuild trust." The proposal was unexpected, but Marcus could feel the sincerity in the commissioner's words. He had heard too many empty promises in his life to take everything at face value. But something about this moment felt different. It felt like a genuine attempt to make things right. "I'll do it," Marcus said after a long pause, "but I need to make one thing clear. This can't be just a symbolic gesture. If we're going to change anything, we need to be honest about the problems. And we need to hold people accountable." The commissioner nodded. "I agree. That's why I want you involved. Your voice, your experience, it matters, and it will guide us as we move forward." Over the next few weeks, Marcus worked closely with the department to help shape the task force. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he doubted the sincerity of those involved. There were people who seemed more interested in maintaining the status quo than in making real change. But Marcus kept pushing forward, reminding himself of the bigger picture. Meanwhile, the video of the traffic stop continued to spread. It had become a rallying cry for those who had been marginalized, a symbol of the deep-seated racism that still plagued many institutions. Protests erupted in cities across the country, demanding justice for those who had been unfairly targeted. The conversation was no longer just about Marcus. It was about a movement that was gaining momentum, fueled by the anger and frustration of people who had been ignored for far too long. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus found himself becoming a reluctant leader in this movement. He spoke at rallies, attended community meetings, and used his newfound platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced. He was no longer just a victim of injustice. He was a part of something much larger. He was fighting for change, for a better future for his community. But the road to change was never easy. There were setbacks. There were people who resisted the idea of reform, people who didn't believe that systemic racism was a problem, people who thought the issue would just fade away. But Marcus refused to back down. He had seen too much. He had lived it. And then, one day, the breakthrough came. It was a quiet afternoon when the commissioner called Marcus with news. The department had implemented a new set of policies aimed at addressing racial profiling, including mandatory bias training for officers, the creation of community oversight committees, and new measures to ensure transparency in policing. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. He knew the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done. But the wheels of change were turning, and they had already come farther than anyone had expected. The following months were a blur of meetings, protests, and more media attention. What had started as an isolated incident had evolved into something far greater than anyone had expected. As the task force grew, so did the pressure. But Marcus had become accustomed to the weight of expectation. He had found his voice, his purpose, and he would not back down. The conversations around racial profiling, police reform, and accountability had moved from the streets to the halls of power. Marcus found himself meeting with lawmakers, community organizers, and even activists who had been fighting for justice long before his own story had become viral. The pain in their voices resonated deeply with him, reminding him of his own journey, the years of silent suffering, the humiliation, the frustration. It had all led him to this moment. But even as things seemed to be moving in the right direction, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had been part of something huge, a movement that was reshaping the way people thought about justice and equality. But in the back of his mind, he knew that true change wouldn't come from just new policies or hashtags. It would come from the heart. It would come from people learning how to see each other, truly see each other, as human beings. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window at the city lights below. He had accomplished so much, but there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. The struggle was far from over. The tension between progress and resistance was palpable, and sometimes it felt like one step forward led to 2 steps back. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from the commissioner. "We did it. The department's reforms are officially in place. It's only the beginning, but we're on the right track." Marcus smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. The reforms were a victory, yes, but they were also a reminder of everything that had led up to this point. The pain, the sacrifice, the tears. They were a start, but they were far from the end. The next day, Marcus stood before a crowd of hundreds at a rally that had been organized to celebrate the progress they had made. The speakers before him had all talked about the reforms, about the importance of continuing to push for change. But when it was his turn, Marcus stood in front of the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He began to speak, his voice steady and sure. "We've made progress," he said, "but we still have a long way to go. This isn't just about laws and policies. It's about changing the way we see each other. It's about understanding that we're all human, all deserving of respect, of dignity, and that's something we can all start working on today." The crowd was silent, and for a moment, Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had spent so much time fighting, so much time pushing for change, that he had almost forgotten why it mattered. It wasn't about the fight itself. It was about the people, about creating a world where no one had to endure what he had. As the rally ended, Marcus walked off the stage, his heart full. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but now he wasn't just a symbol of injustice. He was a part of the solution, and that made all the difference. In the years that followed, Marcus continued to be a voice for change, working with community leaders, law enforcement, and activists to ensure that the reforms stayed in place and continued to evolve. He became a mentor to others, teaching them not only about the fight for justice but about the importance of love, compassion, and forgiveness. The video of his encounter with the racist cop had long since faded from the headlines, but its impact was still being felt. It had sparked a conversation that was still ongoing, one that had brought people together and torn down walls of division. It had led to change, real, lasting change, and Marcus knew that, despite the hardships, it had all been worth it. If you liked the video, consider subscribing. See you in the next video.